It's December 2nd, 1805, and on a frozen battlefield near the small town of Austerlitz in the Austrian Empire, one man is about to change the face of Europe forever. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 36 years old, stands on the Pratzen Heights watching as the largest armies in Europe march toward each other in the pale morning light. In just a few hours, he'll deliver what military historians call one of the greatest tactical masterpieces in the history of warfare. But this battle isn't just about military genius. It's the moment when a Corsican upstart transforms himself into the master of an entire continent. This is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who wasn't even French by birth, conquered virtually all of Europe and built an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia. It's a tale of military brilliance, political cunning, and sheer audacity that redrew the map of Europe and changed the course of world history. But to understand how Napoleon conquered Europe, you need to understand the world he inherited when he seized power in France in 1799. Europe was a patchwork of ancient kingdoms, crumbling empires, and city-states that had been fighting each other for centuries. The French Revolution had terrified every monarch on the continent, and they were all determined to crush this dangerous new idea that people could overthrow their kings and govern themselves. When Napoleon staged his coup d'état in November 1799, France was surrounded by enemies and teetering on the edge of collapse. The country had been at war almost continuously since 1792, fighting coalition after coalition of European powers determined to destroy the French Republic. The economy was in ruins, the government was paralyzed by internal conflicts, and French armies were losing battles across multiple fronts. Napoleon saw this chaos not as a disaster but as an opportunity. While other politicians were wringing their hands about France's desperate situation, Napoleon was already planning how to turn France's enemies against each other and transform military necessity into imperial ambition. The key to Napoleon's success wasn't just his military genius, though that was certainly part of it. The real secret was his understanding that war and politics were inseparable. Every battle Napoleon fought served a political purpose, and every political move was designed to give him a military advantage. He wasn't just conquering territories. He was reshaping the entire European political system to serve French interests. Napoleon's first major test came in 1804 when Austria, Russia, and Britain formed the Third Coalition against France. These weren't small countries Napoleon was facing. These were the great powers of Europe, with centuries of military tradition and vast resources at their disposal. Austria controlled much of Central Europe, Russia commanded seemingly endless armies, and Britain ruled the seas with the most powerful navy in the world. But Napoleon had advantages his enemies didn't fully understand. The French army wasn't just bigger than its opponents, it was fundamentally different. The Revolution had transformed French society, and Napoleon had transformed the French military. His soldiers weren't fighting for a distant king or abstract principles. They were fighting for their own country, for their own advancement, for the promise of glory and plunder that Napoleon dangled before them. More importantly, Napoleon had created something entirely new in European warfare, a meritocratic military system where ability mattered more than birth. His marshals weren't aristocrats who'd bought their commissions. They were men who'd proven themselves in battle. His officers knew that victory could make them rich and powerful, while defeat meant not just military failure but personal disaster. The campaign of 1805 began with Napoleon facing what seemed like impossible odds. The Austrian and Russian armies were converging on France from the east, while British gold was funding a massive coalition designed to crush the French Empire once and for all. Napoleon's enemies controlled more territory, had more soldiers, and possessed far greater financial resources. Napoleon's response was typically audacious. Instead of waiting for his enemies to attack France, he would attack them first. In one of the most brilliant strategic moves in military history, Napoleon abandoned his plans to invade Britain and instead marched his Grande Armée across Europe at lightning speed to strike his enemies before they could coordinate their attacks. The march itself was a masterpiece of military organization. Napoleon moved over 200,000 men across 600 miles in just 6 weeks, covering distances that should have taken months in a time when armies usually traveled at walking pace. His soldiers didn't just march faster than their enemies, They marched faster than news of their movements could travel. This speed wasn't just about moving quickly. It was about concentrating superior force at the decisive point. While his enemies were still figuring out where Napoleon was, he was already surrounding and destroying their armies piece by piece. This became the hallmark of Napoleonic warfare. Move faster than your enemies can think, hit them where they're weakest, and destroy them before they can coordinate a response. The Austrian general Karl Mack learned this lesson the hard way at Ulm in October 1805. Mack had positioned his army to block what he thought would be Napoleon's line of advance, only to discover that the French had already marched around behind him and cut off his retreat. Without firing a shot, Napoleon had trapped 30,000 Austrian soldiers and forced their surrender. But the real test came at Austerlitz on December 2nd, 1805. Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia, nearly 90,000 men commanded by two emperors who were absolutely determined to crush the upstart French dictator once and for all. On paper, Napoleon was badly outnumbered and fighting on enemy territory with winter approaching. Napoleon's solution was to make his enemies think they were winning until the moment he destroyed them. He deliberately weakened his right flank and pretended to retreat from the crucial high ground of the Pratzen Heights, convincing the Allied commanders that they had found his weak point. When the Russian and Austrian forces attacked what they thought was a vulnerable French position, they walked straight into the most famous trap in military history. At the crucial moment, Napoleon launched his real attack against the enemy center, which had been weakened when troops were moved to exploit what they thought was Napoleon's mistake. French forces swept up the Pratzen Heights and split the Allied army in two, turning an organized battle into a complete rout. In a single day, Napoleon had destroyed the armies of two emperors and eliminated the Third Coalition as an effective fighting force. The Battle of Austerlitz wasn't just a military victory. It was a political earthquake that reshaped the entire balance of power in Europe. Austria was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Pressburg, giving up vast territories and paying enormous indemnities. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 800 years, was formally dissolved. Napoleon had proven that the old order in Europe was finished. But Napoleon wasn't content with one stunning victory. He understood that in European politics, military success had to be followed up with political consolidation. Over the next year, he methodically restructured Central Europe to serve French interests, creating the Confederation of the Rhine as a buffer state between France and its enemies. The Confederation wasn't just a political arrangement. It was a revolutionary new concept that challenged the entire basis of European politics. Instead of the complex web of feudal obligations and dynastic claims that had governed Europe for centuries, Napoleon created a rational system based on French administrative efficiency and legal equality. This administrative revolution was just as important as Napoleon's military victories. Everywhere French armies went, they brought the Napoleonic Code, which established legal equality, religious tolerance, and rational government administration. For millions of Europeans living under corrupt and inefficient old regimes, French rule often meant better government, fairer laws, and greater opportunities for advancement. But not everyone appreciated Napoleon's gifts of rational administration and legal equality. King Frederick William III of Prussia watched Napoleon's growing power with increasing alarm and finally declared war on France in October 1806. Prussia had once been considered the most professional military power in Europe, with an army trained in the traditions of Frederick the Great. Napoleon's response to the Prussian challenge demonstrated just how completely he had revolutionized European warfare. On October 14, 1806, Napoleon fought two separate battles on the same day at Jena and Auerstedt, and won both of them decisively. The destruction of Prussian military power was so complete that Napoleon entered Berlin less than 2 weeks later. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt weren't just military victories. They were a demonstration that the old European military system was obsolete. Prussia's army, which had been the envy of Europe 50 years earlier, was swept away by French forces that moved faster, hit harder, and adapted more quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Napoleon's occupation of Berlin was a symbolic moment that announced to all of Europe that a new era had begun. The capital of Frederick the Great was now occupied by a Corsican who had been nobody just 10 years earlier. Napoleon stood in the palace of the Prussian kings and issued the Berlin Decree, launching the continental system that was designed to destroy British economic power through economic warfare. The continental system was Napoleon's most ambitious attempt to reshape Europe according to his vision. By closing European ports to British trade, Napoleon hoped to strangle Britain economically while creating a unified European market under French leadership. This wasn't just about military conquest anymore. Napoleon was trying to create a new European economic and political order with France at its center. But the continental system also demonstrated the limits of Napoleon's power. Economic warfare required the cooperation of every European government, and Napoleon discovered that military conquest didn't automatically translate into political compliance. Countries might surrender their armies, but forcing them to abandon profitable trade relationships was much more difficult. The enforcement of the continental system would eventually drag Napoleon into conflicts that overextended his resources and created new enemies. Portugal's refusal to close its ports to British trade led to the Peninsular War, which became a running sore that drained French resources for years. Similarly, Russia's eventual withdrawal from the continental system would trigger the disastrous invasion of 1812 that marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. But in 1807, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. His victory over Prussia had been followed by a difficult but ultimately successful campaign against Russia, culminating in the bloody Battle of Friedland in June 1807. Tsar Alexander I, recognizing that continued resistance was futile, agreed to meet Napoleon at Tilsit to negotiate a comprehensive peace settlement. The meeting at Tilsit in July 1807 represented the peak of Napoleon's power and influence. The Emperor of France and the Tsar of Russia met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River and divided Europe between them like two gods parceling out the world. Napoleon had achieved something that no French ruler since Charlemagne had even attempted: the domination of continental Europe from the Atlantic to the borders of Asia. Under the treaties of Tilsit, Russia agreed to join the continental system against Britain, while Napoleon gained recognition of all his conquests and the right to reorganize Germany as he saw fit. Prussia was humiliated, losing half its territory and being forced to pay crushing war indemnities. Poland was reborn as the Duchy of Warsaw under French protection, giving Napoleon a strategic foothold in Eastern Europe. The years following Tilsit saw Napoleon at the height of his imperial ambitions. He placed his brothers on the thrones of Spain, Holland, and Westphalia, creating a family empire that stretched across Europe. His stepson became Viceroy of Italy, while his marshals were elevated to princely rank and given territories to govern. Napoleon had created a new European nobility based on military merit rather than ancient bloodlines. This period also saw Napoleon's most successful attempt to create a lasting institutional framework for his empire. The Napoleonic Code became the legal foundation for dozens of European states, while French administrative practices revolutionized government efficiency across the continent. Napoleon established a continental university system, standardized weights and measures, and created infrastructure projects that connected his empire with roads, canals, and telegraph lines. By 1810, Napoleon's empire had reached its greatest territorial extent. The French Empire itself stretched from Hamburg to Rome, while French client states and allies controlled territory from Spain to the borders of Russia. Napoleon commanded the largest army in European history and ruled over a population of nearly 70 million people directly, with millions more under the authority of his allies and satellites. But 1810 also marked the beginning of the problems that would ultimately destroy Napoleon's empire. The continental system was proving impossible to enforce completely, and the economic strain of constant warfare was beginning to tell on French resources. More ominously, Napoleon's very success was creating a coalition of enemies determined to prevent any single power from dominating Europe so completely. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon called the Peninsular War, was bleeding French resources white. What should have been a simple occupation had turned into a vicious guerrilla war that tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops. British forces under Wellington were supporting Spanish and Portuguese resistance, creating a second front that Napoleon couldn't ignore but couldn't win decisively. Even more dangerous was the growing tension with Russia. Tsar Alexander had never been comfortable with his subordinate role in the French alliance, and Russian nobles were furious about the economic costs of the continental system. Russian withdrawal from the anti-British trade war threatened the entire basis of Napoleon's strategy for defeating his most persistent enemy. Napoleon's response to Russian defiance was characteristically bold and ultimately catastrophic. In 1812, he assembled the largest army in European history, over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire, for an invasion of Russia designed to force Tsar Alexander back into the continental system. The invasion of Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's European empire. Despite initial French successes and the occupation of Moscow, the campaign turned into a disaster when winter set in, and Russian forces adopted a strategy of strategic retreat that stretched French supply lines to the breaking point. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. Of the 600,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 30,000 returned in fighting condition. Napoleon had lost not just an army, but the aura of invincibility that had been crucial to maintaining his control over Europe. The destruction of the Grande Armée in Russia triggered a general European uprising against French rule. Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed a new coalition, while French client states began defecting to the Allied cause. The empire that had seemed so solid just 2 years earlier suddenly looked fragile and overextended. Napoleon's last great victory came at Dresden in August 1813, where he defeated a combined Allied army and demonstrated that his tactical genius remained intact. But strategic genius couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of being outnumbered by enemies on multiple fronts who were finally coordinating their efforts effectively. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, where Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden in what became known as the Battle of the Nations. For 3 days, over 500,000 men fought in the largest battle in European history up to that time. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig marked the effective end of his empire east of the Rhine. The collapse of Napoleon's European empire was as sudden and dramatic as its creation had been. Within months of Leipzig, French forces were retreating across Germany, and by 1814, Allied armies were marching on Paris itself. Napoleon's marshals, who had followed him to glory across Europe, finally refused to continue a hopeless fight. Napoleon's first abdication in April 1814 marked the end of the most remarkable career in European history. In less than 15 years, he had risen from artillery officer to master of Europe, conquered most of the continent, and created an empire that briefly seemed destined to last for centuries. But Napoleon's conquest of Europe wasn't ultimately about military victories or territorial acquisitions. It was about the spread of revolutionary ideas that would reshape European society for generations. The Napoleonic Code, the principle of careers open to talent, religious tolerance, and rational administration, all survived the fall of Napoleon's political empire. The Europe that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars was fundamentally different from the Europe that had existed before the French Revolution. The old feudal order was gone forever, replaced by modern nation-states based on popular sovereignty and legal equality. The map of Europe had been redrawn, but more importantly, the mental map of what was possible in politics and society had been transformed. Napoleon's brief return during the 100 Days and final defeat at Waterloo in June 1815 was really just an epilogue to a story that had already ended. The man who had conquered Europe died in exile on the remote island of St. Helena, but his legacy lived on in the legal codes, administrative systems, and political ideas that he had spread across the continent. Looking back at Napoleon's conquest of Europe, what seems most remarkable isn't the speed with which he built his empire, but the lasting impact of the changes he introduced. Military empires come and go, but the principles of legal equality, religious tolerance, and meritocratic government that Napoleon established proved to be permanent features of modern European civilization. Napoleon conquered Europe not just through military genius, but by offering Europeans a vision of rational, efficient government that was superior to the corrupt and inefficient old regimes he replaced. His empire fell when the costs of maintaining it through constant warfare became unbearable. but the ideas he represented continued to shape European development long after his defeat. The story of how Napoleon conquered Europe is ultimately the story of how revolutionary France transformed the entire continent through a combination of military pressure and institutional innovation. It's a reminder that lasting conquest isn't just about winning battles. It's about offering people something better than what they had before.